All right, folks. Hello and welcome to the third part of some of the most violent tornadoes that have ever happened in the US. This is, of course, the third part out of five. Parts one and two will be listed in the description below, as well as all of the sources that I'll use for this video, of course. Also, before we get started into looking at our honorable mentions, a few disclaimers. This is not a comprehensive list of every single F5 and EF5 that the United States has ever seen. There is close to 70, the number is like 68, that have happened in the US since 1950, and that is a 12-part series or more, depending on how far you look back before 1950 with these tornadoes, and we are looking at just 20 in this entire series. This is looking at another 4. We have looked at 8 in the two previous parts combined. So, four per video. This is also only tornadoes that have ever happened just in the US. That's not to say that other violent tornadoes that have not happened throughout the rest of the world. They absolutely have. But the amount of information, especially today, that is available with tornadoes that happen in the US is pretty much unparalleled compared to the rest of the world. The US might not be the best model in some areas, that is for sure, but in terms of weather forecasting and predicting and research and recording, I would say that the US is by far the best at that. So, without any further ado, we are going to look at our honorable mentions, the first of which being the Jordan, Iowa F5 that happened in June of 1976. Unfortunately, I don't have any damage photos or photos of the tornado itself. However, I really want to include this because Dr. Fujita, the tornadologist, whose namesake is the Fujita scale, an enhanced Fujita scale, said that this was some of the worst damage that he had ever seen by a tornado, which is even more surprising to me that there are no damage photos, at least that I found. Even a tornado photo that is said to be from the Jordan, Iowa tornado can be traced back to not be the tornado. So this made it very frustrating to research this thing, as source after source just says the same thing, pretty much what Fujita said. A tornado that has a little bit more on it, however, unfortunately, not saying too much, is the Mercer, Pennsylvania F5 that happened in May of '85. This tornado is estimated to have had wind speeds of more than 261 miles per hour, more than 420 kilometers per hour, which is essentially that's the very peak of F5 technically is 260. However, since the Fujita scale, I guess, has ended, you can say that goes from, I think it's 206, 207 to 302 or 318, depending on your view there. Lastly, an infamous tornado, especially within the weather community, but a very difficult one to research, is the Andover, Kansas F5. I would have loved to include this tornado as a highlight. I really would have. This is an infamous tornado with that home video that looks like that it is just this twister just boiling in the sky, moving along, destroying everything, with winds estimated to be more than 261 miles per hour. However, there's not that much information on it other than that, which is really frustrating, especially with how famous this thing is. It's it's still frustrating to me even today. So we are looking at the Roanoke F4 that happened in July of 2004 instead, more or less. This tornado is estimated to have had wind speeds of anywhere from 210 to 240 miles per hour. That's 338 to 386 kilometers per hour. Easily the most, uh, probably the closest estimate for tornado wind speed I've ever seen on the original Fujita scale, as normally it's just, yes, the entirety of the F4 wind range, which is a fair bit, keep in mind, so that is not a good window, but 210 to 240 is. Keep in mind that this tornado was thankfully only F3 and F4 in particular for a relatively short time. However, when it was at F4 strength, it obliterated Parsons manufacturing plant. Out of the 140 people that were in this building, only 3 were lightly injured. This manufacturing plant already had, I believe it was 3 or 4, even 5 storm shelters in the plant. And when they rebuilt, they increased the number of storm shelters to anywhere from 7 to 8. And when they were rebuilding, they paid their workers who couldn't even work. That is incredible. That should serve as a model for what you should do with tornado recovery. And this is a smaller company than Amazon. What is Amazon doing? Amazon is on something and is truly horrible, especially with just regular working conditions in Amazon. Granted, I don't work at Amazon, but yeah, especially considering stuff like the Taylorville EF3 that happened, I think, in either 2019 or 2021, as well as some other incidents before. This thing would launch large steel beams 3/4 of a mile, that's 1.2 kilometers, from parts of its manufacturing plants. This thing would also destroy 3 large farms along its track when it was F3. This thing exhibited some windrowing tendencies that was seen with the parts of manufacturing plants, as well as those 3 large farms. And this is thankfully a tornado that spared both Metamora, Eureka, and Roanoke, coming very close to Roanoke, which is why it is called the Roanoke F4, despite not hitting it, thank goodness. An extremely violent monster is the Hackleburg, Alabama tornado. This is the last of the 2011 super outbreak tornadoes in this series. We've gone over all 4 of them now, and this tornado was estimated to be 210 miles per hour strong. That is 338 kilometers per hour. This thing would strike the communities of Hackleburg, Phil Campbell, Oak Grove, and Mount Hope, all at EF5 strength, producing producing one of the longest tracks of EF5 damage you will see on ArcGIS. This thing would tear the concrete roof off of a concrete storm shelter, a storm pit. Storm pits, I think I went over this before, but for those that don't know what a storm pit is, they are especially common where soil consistencies simply do not allow the construction of basements, more or less. Basements, usually, of course, below ground, but when you have a very clay-like consistency soil, that can be a problem, as that is going to exhibit a lot of force on walls and also is very, very moisture heavy, so that's going to create a lot of moisture problems in the basement as well. The next best thing is just a big concrete pit, either partially or all the way in the ground. This concrete shelter was pretty much all the way in the ground with just the roof on the surface, and it tore away the thing that was on the surface. That is insane. That roof is meant to stay there. A 25 section of asphalt was ripped away, completely destroyed in the process, and launched 1/3 of a mile, if not a little bit more. This thing was most violent in Oak Grove itself, and this thing would pull up fence posts that were 18 inches deep. This is something I actually didn't know until I researched this video, spared the Browns Ferry nuclear power plant by just 2 miles, or 3.2 kilometers. Now, would anything happen if this tornado hit the power plant? My guess, of course, I don't think a tornado has actually ever hit a nuclear power plant, but my guess would be that the worst that could happen would be that it would destroy the concrete funnel where the steam comes out of, and that's really it. Because to my knowledge, it's really the only thing it could even do. The core is practically foolproof with cesium. Even if the core was destroyed somehow, the cesium rods or the control rods that they can put in should be able to at least stop any fission or fusion. I forget which one. Fission from occurring. So probably nothing would happen even if it did hit this power plant. I don't want to say it's interesting because that makes it seem like I wanted to hit that power plant. I don't, but it would certainly be a sight. That's for sure. An absolute violent monster as well happened just under a month later. The El Reno Piedmont F5 measured winds of instantaneous more than 270 miles per hour, estimated to regularly be 210 miles per hour. So regular 338, possibly more than 434 kilometers per hour strong, all the way up to 296 kilometer or miles per hour. The on-land oil rig that was more than 1 million pounds heavy, Cactus 117, was completely annihilated, rolled 3 times the whole spiel. Something I learned from this while researching this video, though, even though I've talked about this tornado before, is that its oil boring equipment was inside the borehole when this tornado struck, creating tens of thousands of pounds of downforce, and it was still ripped away from that, which is extremely impressive. This thing created vast swaths of EF3 and EF4 damage and was preliminarily rated. I think it was at least EF3, and it was then upgraded to EF4, and then almost stayed that way, actually. We'll get to that in just a little bit here. Some cars were thrown up to a kilometer away in this in this bottom right middle photo here. We can see that, well, the car was red, and that's about all I got. This thing engaged in the Fujiwara effect with its own satellite tornado. The Fujiwara effect is when two low pressures circle around each other within a point that's outside of both of them, so they are rotating around themselves counterclockwise, something very interesting that normally happens with hurricanes instead. It was found that nails were used instead of bolts for anchoring homes in many places, which limited the EF3 and EF4 damage. However, this thing was rated EF5 because it destroyed such unconventional things, let's say, that they needed to come up with unconventional DIs. DIs meaning damage indicators, such as Cactus 117 being an EF5 DI, or a storm shelter with its handle being gone. That is something. Also, thank you to Oklahoma Tornado Database on Twitter for both of these storm shelter photos, both in here and for the Hackleburg tornado. That was something that I saw that I originally did not have in this video that I thought would be very interesting to include. So this tornado is pretty unique in having some very unconventional DIs used in its rating. The very last EF5 to have ever hit the planet so far, this is of May 2024, this is of May 26th, 2024, as of right now, is the Moore, Oklahoma F5 that struck a little bit more than, what is that, 11 years ago to this day of recording. The last EF5 to date was rated at 210 miles per hour, or 340 kilometers per hour. This tornado produced 363 EF4 damage indicators and only 9 EF5 damage indicators, with most of these photos seen here being EF5 damage indicators. 3 oil tanks were thrown more than a mile. However, there was 4. There was 4 oil tanks that they knew of, or that were originally placed somewhere. They were thrown more than a mile, which is 1.6 kilometers. I think these things weighed something around 10 or more tons, and they didn't find the 4th one, and they still haven't to this day. We have no idea where that thing went. It went to the Shadow Realm. This thing was likely EF5 in Celestial Acres right before hitting more, and that is based mostly on surrounding damage and so contextual damage. However, contextual damage can have a lot of complicated things going on there, such as a car hitting a building and then the tornado strikes the building. That is something completely different to the tornado straight up wholly destroying that entire building. There are complicating factors to contextual damage, so it is plausibly EF5 at the very least. This thing intensified in more, where it was finally officially rated EF5 there, with a loop right near the Moore Medical Center, where it would also very nicely, but also very rudely, because it destroyed the cars, nicely pack more than a dozen or so cars right at the entrance of the medical center. It was also near the medical center where a manhole cover was found to be removed. This thing would narrow and weaken, tip a little bit unusual for a stronger tornado. Usually they narrow and strengthen, but I digress. Still being EF4 until nearly the very, very end of its life. So, what did we see from these four very violent storms? We saw that one happened in July, one happened in April, and two happened in May, for a grand total now of 5 in April, 6 in May, and 1 in July. These four incredible forces of nature only caused 105 deaths, or that is still 105 too many. More than 500 people were injured from these twisters, and overall caused at least $3 billion in damage. Granted that it's not properly adjusted for inflation. 2004 USD is different from 2011 USD, which is different from 2013 USD. So I didn't properly adjust it. I just added all the totals together. Sorry. With that being said, folks, that is all that I have for part 3. Part 4 will be the next video up here. I hope that you all enjoyed this video and learned something from it. I thank you all so much for watching. Now I'll see you all in the next one.